Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community, is brought to you by Handy Quilter, designed by a quilter for quilters. Sulky, express yourself with Sulky and create with confidence. Brother, it's so easy with Brother at your side. And Quilt Cut, easy fabric cutting for quilters.
Hello, I'm Patrick Lose and welcome to Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community. I'm here with my friend Kay Capps-Cross and we've been working on my Heart to Heart project from my Party with Patrick Club. How you doing, Kay?
Just fine.
Are you ready to get this thing bound?
I am. It's been fun so far.
It has been, and it's actually been a really easy process, and I love showing how things that people think are a little intimidating or too technical for them can really be simplified and worth doing. So what we ended up with on the last segment was this long strip of continuous bias binding that we cut from a simple 14-inch square.
Yeah, very small.
But we need to, prepare this like any other binding, like just a straight grain binding, and we're going to have to fold it and meet the raw edges and get that pressed. And would you like to do that for me? Great. So Kay will go over to the iron, and just like any other binding that we make, we've got to get the edges pressed, the raw edges pressed together. And one of the things, I'm kind of a stickler on this because I think it's very important that the raw edges of the binding, when you fold it over and meet them, they have to meet exactly before you actually press them permanently. The reason for that is it's hard to imagine that a hair, being off a hair is that much, but if you're off a 1/16 of an inch when you press this, and then you go to sew it onto your raw edge, as you're doing your binding, that becomes double. That becomes an 1/8 of an inch by the time you calculate both sides being off that much.
Multiplies quickly, doesn't it?
It does, and an 1/8 of an inch, when you consider that you're doing a 2 1/4 inch binding that's sewn on at 1/4 of an inch, you're down to only having about 3/8 of that binding, 3/8 of an inch of that binding visible.
Right.
And that's what's bad, is because you take an 1/8 of an inch out of that, it can get really wonky going from 3/8 to 1/4 to less than that or whatever. So
we also had to be careful of the bias, didn't we? You have to be careful you don't stretch it when you press
you're
it.
pressing. Yeah, that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. If you're pressing and pulling on the binding, let's just show. You can see how much this will stretch and give. That's a lot.
That's a lot of give.
And then when you press over that, you're sort of making that stretch permanent.
Right.
And a lot of shaping of costumes and fashion and things like that is done by cutting things on the bias. A lot of the 1930s gowns that just hung on those skinny models, it was because they were bias cut gowns.
Yeah, I'm making one for my daughter for prom.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Cool. Very cool. Well, the next thing that we have to do then is to get this pinned on. And we're working with a scalloped edge here that is a little tricky to pin. But again, just like when you're, Kay, I'm going to give you these pins if you would kind of hand them to me. It's important that you start pinning and leave a tail.
Yes, because you have a great way to join those when you get to the end, don't you?
Yeah, to make it just continuous. And I usually do my pinning this way and have the point the other direction, so I take the pins out from this direction. But again, it's really important that you don't make this too far off of the edge. And I don't usually use pins to put my binding on straight projects like straight quilts or whatever.
No, I don't either.
But I use pins for this most of the time because the bias binding has too much give to it and can really get stretched out of shape.
And you have to be careful where you release that give a little and where you keep it together, don't you, when you're doing
That's
curves?
Mostly as I sew. And honestly, I'm not going to pin around the entire edge because I'm so used to doing this that without the pins in the binding, I can show you what I'm talking about as I sew. Because if you get to stretching the binding, it's going to start turning funky on you. Okay, and now I think I'll just step over to the machine and stitch this. We don't have to put all the pins in.
Okay, I've got the seat warm for you.
Thank you. All right. Okay, so to start this, you want to leave a long tail. And actually, I think I want to make it a little bit longer than that. So I'm going to take one of these pins out. And that's actually where I'm going to start stitching. And I'm going to stitch this at 1/4 of an inch, or a scant quarter, just because it's bias and it gives, and I want to have enough to fold over.
Yeah. It does eat up some in that actual seam, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. See, pins get in my way. I've done this so much that I can usually do it without the pins. And it's important that you're just easing any fullness in that binding into that curve. And you can see, do you see that ripple there that was created? That's the ease that needs to happen. You just need to do that without actually sewing over.
The
you don't want
ripple
any
or
puckers,
the, right.
yeah. And that can happen in a straight binding also, but straight grain binding.
So once again, if it looks goofy when you're doing it, it's probably right.
Yeah, actually. It's a little clumsy, to try to manipulate the fullness in the binding as you're sewing it, especially if you're like me and you don't use pins. But I would rather not use pins and not have blood all over the binding.
Well, you can feel
I can
with
tell
your
where.
fingers too.
Right,
I mean,
I
our
can tell
fingers
where
are
I am.
so good at
Yes.
getting things just right.
Right.
That sound memory in our fingers. Wow, you really do that well.
Well, I'm a little bit off there, and I don't want to be, so I'm going to cheat that back over. And I'm doing this also for just the speed of being able to show this whole thing in this episode, or I might have put a few more pins in.
It's just something that takes a little bit of patience, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Just have to slow down a little bit.
But it's worth it. I mean, this is a skill that I think every quilter needs to have. So many quilters are afraid to try anything that has a scalloped edge or that's round, and it's because they think they can't do the binding. And I'm telling you, there was a point where I thought I couldn't do it, and I can do it now. So practice makes perfect. And I'm just going to finish it up right here because I need to stop so that we can overlap our ends.
Oh, and I love the way you do this.
This is another thing that a lot of quilters don't know, and they'll just slap one end of the binding over the other and stitch, and this is a lot cleaner way to do it.
You mean that isn't okay to do it the other way?
Well, sure. I mean, anything's okay if that's how you do it. If that's how you're comfortable. But I think a lot of quilters feel that their quilts look better when the binding's just one continuous piece. So, and sometimes I have to tear back a little bit, and I think I'm going to have to do that here. I think I went a little too far, and that's all right. But what you want to do at this point is where you want your binding to begin and end, where the seam would be, we have to cut, at that point. So I know that the binding needs to finish all the way around, but let's say I want it to end, and on a scalloped edge it is a little bit trickier to do. I'm going to bring it right to the center of the curve on the outside edge, and that's where I want it to stop, okay? This is such a final move, but I think it's fine. We're just going to cut it there, okay?
Drum roll, please.
Yes, there we go. Okay, now, in order to, we know that ended like right at the middle there, and I need to bring this one up to it in the same way, just sort of, estimate, but fairly accurately.
We have bias gives a little more leeway, doesn't it?
It does, well, and it stretches, yeah. But we have to overlap here's our beginning point, right there. We have to overlap and go beyond that point by the width of our binding.
Okay.
2 1/4 inches. And again, I do this all the time, so I know what 2 1/4 inches is, and it can be, estimated. But you also have to take into consideration that bias binding stretches. So on a straight binding, I would cut this 2 1/4 inches beyond that cut edge on the underside. On this, I'm going to do it about 2 1/8, even 2, because it's going to stretch.
That little bit, yeah.
Yeah, and it'll be too big if I don't. So right about there, I would say, is a good point to cut. Ooh, I almost cut through both. Okay. Now, this again is a visual thing that it's going to help. I'm going to take this back just a little further. You need to open the bindings out. You place the left hand side, the end of the binding, wrong side of fabric down. The right side you place right side down, right side of the fabric.
Okay.
One on top of the other at a right angle, just like you're piecing any binding strips that you cut for any quilt. And let's do pin this because it can get a little out of hand. We're going to pin it evenly with, so it's a true right angle so that we can make a mitered seam. I don't know if you can see that, but let's see if I can pin
Oh, you want one more?
Yeah, one more.
There you go.
And again, I don't really think that, I think I sewed too much. I think I should have
Let
released a
loose,
little bit.
yeah.
Yes. Okay, so just like piecing any binding, we're going to stitch from this corner to this corner to make that mitered seam.
Yep, and just eyeball it, right? We just get to go from point to point, and it's a
do.
short little
That's
seam.
right, that's right. My pin is going to be in the way, so I'll just take that out. Cut my thread.
And that should fit perfectly, shouldn't it?
It should. One always hopes.
I have faith.
I think it is going to work, I can tell. But what we want to do first, and honestly, before I cut that, let's do,
Just to check.
that's going to be fine. It might be a little loose, but I can deal with that. We're going to cut that at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, just like we normally would on a straight grain binding. We'll just finger press
Okay.
this open, and I think that'll work. There we go. Finger press it open, fold it, pin around the outside edge. We're running out of time, so I'm not going to go through the stitching, but I think you can get the idea.
Yeah, we get the idea, and that is really so much neater than tucking the ends in, having it go continuously around.
Right, right. Not having an overlap
Right,
on
you
the
don't have that
outside
extra
that's-
bulk in there.
It is
or-
extra bulk, and that, these, I always say that I'm not making heirloom quilts, but when you think about it, you really are, you just don't know it. Someone's going to someday want to have that piece and want to, you want it to look nice. And that turned out exactly.
That looks great. So it's that width of the binding, the 2 1/4, whatever your
Right.
binding is, that's what your overlap
Right.
is.
So the only other thing that I want to show is that when you turn the binding out, and it does help to press the binding away from the quilt top, especially a bias binding. Look at how it just
beautiful.
it just falls right where it needs to on the back side. And I do iron the binding and steam it. Okay, so I think that looks great, especially the way it folds over the back, the bias binding. And I think there couldn't be a simpler way to show
No.
how to do bias binding, and that's something that is such a has such mystique to it for a lot of quilters. So
Especially on curves.
curves and scalloped edged curves. Yeah. Kay's got the finished or the original project here to show you how that binding looks. I think it's great.
Looks wonderful.
I want to thank you for being with me to teach this project. I love doing it, and I love teaching you guys the things that I design, and you too, Kay.
It's always a pleasure.
Well, thanks for being with me. And I want to thank you for being with us also on Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters Community.
Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters Community, is brought to you by Handy Quilter, designed by a quilter for quilters. Sulky, express yourself with Sulky and create with confidence. Brother, it's so easy with Brother at your side. And Quilt Cut, easy fabric cutting for quilters.